Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo and cryptids encounter stories. First story. This story was shared by you/Dooman_. Don't go camping in Oklahoma. Alright, now this a story I haven't told in a long time. It happened to me October, 6 years ago. I've told 4 or 5 people since then and none of them believed me. I decided to stop talking about it when someone filed an anonymous tip to my school psychologist. That was 4 years ago. I've had a lot of time to think about it since then, and I think I'm finally ready to post my story somewhere. It's about a weekend I spent in the Washita National Forest. I had been planning the trip for weeks. Made sure I had the weekend off work, didn't make any plans, all of that. Started buying supplies a week before I went. I was gonna go camping in the forest near my town. I had been camping before, when I was a little kid with my parents. But never as an adult, never by myself, and never in this forest. I was so excited. Now, I'm not an idiot. I took all the necessary precautions. I told a few of my friends where I was going, when I was going to be there, and when I'll be back. I told them if I go missing to call the cops and all that. I brought an extra phone battery and enough food and water to last me a fucking week. I even brought along the 9mm that my dad gave me when I turned 18. Never shot the damn thing, but I figured it would at least scare off whatever the hell wanted to mess with me. I'm telling you all of this so you know that I'm not just some dumb kid who decided he wanted to take a trip to the forest one day and shit his pants 'cause he saw a bear. No. I knew what I was getting into. I was prepared. Just not for, well, this. Okay, enough backstory. I'll get on with it. I left around 6 in the morning. It's an hour drive from my place, so I was expecting to get there around 7. Ended getting there at 7:30, but I didn't mind. It was a lovely day, not a cloud in the sky, great weather. Camping in the cold and rain is miserable, so I was pretty content with my arrival time. I parked my car a ways away from the forest in a little clearing off the side of the road where I knew I would find it. I gathered my things, had a little snack, and headed off toward the forest. The next few hours are kinda boring, so I'll skip over them. All you need to know is that I made my way well into the forest, set up a camp, and started enjoying myself. Cooked myself lunch on the crummy campfire I made around noon. Watched a pair of birds dancing at each other. I even took a few pictures of some deer I saw with my phone. Couldn't get a good shot, but it's at least proof I was there. But something seemed off. You see, forests are normally kinda loud. Not like a city loud, but there's this constant background noise that is always going on. Rustling in bushes and leaves, birds chirping and animals prancing around. When I first got into the forest that was all well and good. But the later it got, they sounds just started to go away. Not all at once, it took the better part of the day for me to notice. But yeah, the sounds slowly went away. Birds stopped chirping, bushes stopped rustling. I stopped seeing animals too. That's what made me notice. At around 4 in the afternoon I realized that I hadn't seen a bird in a while. That unsettled me, truth be told. But I steeled myself and kept enjoying the stay. I was feeling kind of lonely, what with the quiet and all, so I called up a friend and chatted with him till sundown. After that I realized it was getting late, so I hung up, ate again, and put out the fire. After a final assessment of my surroundings, a look at the wondrous night sky, I crawled into my tent to sleep. I kept the 9mm loaded right next to where I slept. Just in case, you know. Sleeping on the cold ground in the middle of a forest isn't that easy if you aren't used to it, and considering I hadn't done it since I was a child, I was having a little trouble. It was probably, just a rough estimate, 2 hours after I had lied down that I started hearing something in nature again. Now, if I had heard bushes rustling a few hours earlier, this would have been cause for celebration. But even Bear Grylls would get creeped out if it was the only thing he'd heard all night. So I did what any rational human would have done and clung the 9mm like it was the only thing keeping me from falling off a cliff. There was silence for a few minutes. The only thing I could hear was my own shaky breath. Then, prancing. Ba-da-da-dum. 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 4 footsteps in quick succession. No crunching of leaves or snapping of twigs. Just the steady beat. Ba-da-da-dum. 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 It was getting louder, closer to my tent. I tried to peer through the fabric that separated me from nature, but I couldn't make out a silhouette. I clutched the rifle harder, scared as any person would be. I remember being sure that I would be safe though, even bears will rarely attack camps unprovoked. But that natural human fear, that was overbearing. Making my mind wander and my hands shake. Ba-da-da-dum. Ba-da-da-dum. Ba-da-da. It stopped. Close to my tent. Just outside of my tent. I could feel its presence near me. It was totally silent. I knew that it couldn't have been a bear, it would be sniffing the tent right now if it were. I doubted that it was a deer, they don't come out at night. Perhaps a wolf. They normally travel in packs, and even if it were a lone wolf, it wouldn't be a threat until I heard growling. But nothing. Just silence. And then it screeched. That's when I knew that that thing wasn't anything I'd seen before. Nothing makes that sort of sound. It was like a cross between some sort of bird and a human. Like the shit you hear in movies that possessed people with their heads on backwards make. That's when I let fear take over, in my bladder and in my hands. I fired the gun in its direction, and dear God, was that a mistake. It screeched again and it scratched the tent. Tearing through the fabric, leaving a massive gash in the side. That was my first look at it. If you could call it a look. I barely saw a silhouette through the hole in my tent. But I did see its long arms shredding the side of the tent. It was trying to get to me. I fired the rifle again, but I must have missed, because it didn't flinch. That was when the flight reflex took over the fight, and I only wanted to do one thing, run. I turned around and fiddled with the opening of the tent, trying to keep my eye on the beast attacking me but also trying to secure my escape as fast as I could. I did it, and dove out of the tent breaking into a full sprint. Behind me I heard the thing still tearing into my tent. I thought that maybe it mistook its enemy, or prey, for the tent and not me. But that relief didn't last long. I wasn't far from the tent when I heard its rhythmic prancing again. Asterisk ba-da-da-dum. Ba-da-da-dum. Ba-da-da-dum, asterisk FFF. It was faster than me. Gaining on me. If I tried to outrun it, I would surely be caught. Just then, in what was either a moment of survivalist brilliance or suicidal stupidity, I stopped, and dove into a thick bush near me. I remembered that many predators in the forest rely on seeing movement more than anything else. So if I could stay still, then it would not see me. That decision saved my life. It ran past me, stopping in the same place where I stopped. I didn't notice before I hid, but that spot is just under an opening in the trees. A pillar of light penetrated the oppressive dark and, in the moonlight, I could see my assailant. It was pale, made paler by the white of the moon, and hairless. Thin, like it had not eaten in weeks. I want to say it looked humanoid, but comparing that thing to a human is just wrong. Its hunched back protruded out, making it look larger than any human. It stood on all fours in such a way that no human could. Its rear low to the ground, its long legs bent in such a grotesque fashion that it almost resembled a frog, ready to leap. It circled around, silently, searching for me. I thought it was about to give up, but it threw its horrendous back upwards, and its legs straightened and it stood. On two legs. Like a person. A deformed, horrific human. And then it looked at me. It looked right at me. It saw me. I know it saw me. Nothing looks at you like that without seeing you. I could tell you the color of its damn eyes, and I bet you that it could tell you the color of mine. I clutched the rifle close to my chest. Too scared to use it, too scared to move. I closed my eyes and waiting for it to pounce, and then. Ba-da-da-dum. 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 I opened my eyes, and it was gone. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I fell asleep in that bush, cuddling with the rifle, until finally being awoken by the sounds of birds. Birds, thank God, birds. It was already daylight, the next morning. I wearily stood up, using the rifle as a crutch to support my aching body. Things seemed to be normal. The forest was speaking once again, and birds and deer aplenty were in sight. I stumbles back to my camp to find my things mostly as I had left them. My tent was unsalvageable, but I took my backpack, had something to eat, and I left. Just like I had planned. The entire trek back I didn't stop looking around for that thing. I didn't let the gun leave my hands, either. It wasn't until I got to the car that I relaxed, calling my friend to tell him I was heading home. I didn't tell him about what had happened last night. I was still trying to process it myself. Shit, I don't think I understand wholly what had happened until after the car ride home. And that's where the story ends. 6 years ago, and I haven't gone camping since. I haven't seen the thing again, nor have I heard of anyone who's seen it. As a whole, my life has moved on completely. But I will never forget that thing. I will never forget how it stared at me. And how it just left. It knew I was there, but it left. Why did it do that? I don't think I'll ever get an answer. Second story. The Wendigo who spoke. Hey there, my name's Dante Williams. This post-series is to talk about my experiences of note. The experiences of note I'm referring to is my sightings of something in the woods surrounding my home. I think I have an idea of what it is. It's a Wendigo based off of my research. I know what it is because of physical features it possesses. It's huge, tall as a tree, white as the virgin snow, thin as only a skeleton could be, and it has a deer's skull for a head. The thing that really clinched it for me was the smell, that God-forsaken smell. It smells like if the devil himself took a shit on a pile of rotting meat. Anyways, on to the story I have to tell. I live in northern Illinois, about 50 miles from the border with Wisconsin in a heavy forest. I'm not giving anybody the name here because I don't want any of you crazy bastards to come looking for this thing. I was going out for a hunt as I usually do this time of year. I was carrying my AR-15, with full metal jacket rounds, for the extra oomph. I was about a quarter mile from my house, in a ravine with a deer trail. I was walking towards my hunting tower when the smell hit me. It was just as described, but to my virgin nostrils it was a million times stronger. Having recognized the smell as belonging to a predator, I bolted to my tree stand, and climbed up it faster than ever before. When I was up there, I scoped the area out looking for the predator. All I saw was a mysteriously ominous deer's skull on a hill. I saw nothing, so to scare the predator out I shot my AR into the air 3 times. That's when I saw something I'll never forget. The body of the skull got up. It had hidden the rest of itself under the leaves and dirt of the hillside. I turned around and saw this happen with the most gut-wrenchingly powerful primal fear coming from deep in my head. I suppressed it for just long enough to unload my rifle's mag into the thing. It barely even flinched. I hit it with 27 rounds, with an FMJ, and it did fuck all. The beast, now knowing where I was, looked up at me, and gave a hellish howl, something that couldn't come from anything on this earth. It sounded like a mix between a human scream of pain combined with a rabbit's scream when it's being eaten alive, with heavy distortion in the mix as well. I reloaded so it could see. I could see it watching what I was doing. I aimed back at it in the most dramatic way I could muster. I don't know why I did this, seeing as my previous barrage did nothing, but the act did something. It scared this beast into running away. It bounded off below my tree, and kept going in the opposite way of my house. Thank God. I practically jumped off my tree stand based on how quick I descended the tree. In that moment I sprinted full blast to my house, without pause. I nearly broke down my door when I entered my house. I closed the door, and locked it behind me, then I locked my windows too. I breathed a sigh of relief for just an instant before I noticed something. It was the smell, and it was coming from right in front of me. I looked up from locking my window to see that thing standing in the tree line. I went full blast again. I ran into my basement to hide from this demon in the woods. I first locked the door into my staircase, and then going down my stairs 3 at a time, and entering my basement, then locking the door to that. There were no windows, which is why I ran there. I stayed there for a full 3 hours before the smell left. I decided to look up what that thing may have been, and found it was a Wendigo. I didn't write anything down, as I never saw anything about repeat encounters. That was stupid now that I look back at this. I foolishly assumed that the Wendigo would leave me alone, but boy was I ever wrong. About a month later I was rebuilding a mailbox out of bricks because of a storm destroying my old one. I was highly congested at the time, so I didn't smell much. Instead, this time I heard this thing hiss behind me. Instinctually I sprung up and swung my hand into it to fight back. In that hand was a brick. I slammed this thing right in its jaw, and sent it tumbling to the ground. I sprinted back inside and back into the basement, but this time I thought it had gotten the message because I picked my nose a bit so I could get a better smell, and it was gone. The smell, the beast hopefully with it, was gone. Nothing could possibly prepare me for what came next, because about a month later, when I came home from work, that smell showed up again, and before I could put my car into reverse, the Wendigo was right in front of my car. It was at that moment that it said, "Hello, human." It spoke to me. This abomination, this mistake of God, could speak. "I know you are terrified of me because of my appearance and past confrontations, but I would like to speak with you," said the Wendigo in its distorted voice. "What do you want from me?" I barked into its face from behind my car's windshield. "I would like to speak to you about something," it stated matter-of-factly. "Well, out with it then. What do you want to talk about?" I said to it after a moment of silence. "I have found a way to reverse my curse, and I need your help," it said. "Why would I? No, why should I help you?" I barked at it, still beyond terrified of the thing standing in front of me. "You do not have to, but I promise that should you agree I will never attack, or harass you again. If you so wish you will not even have to speak to me again," it said, getting somewhat clearer in its tone. I was now intrigued. I had never heard of a Wendigo speaking outside of a couple of pieces of fiction, yet here one was speaking to me like we'd been buddies our whole lives. Indulging my intrigue, I asked it, "How would you break your curse?" The Wendigo shifted its stance, and walked to the driver's side window, I assume it being so that I could hear it better. "I need a human to forgive me of my crimes," it said in a low whisper. "Will you so help me as to forgive me?" it asked with an almost embarrassed tone. "Well, I have some questions first before I forgive anyone, starting with, how the hell are you speaking to me? You only screamed and hissed before." The Wendigo looked pensive for a moment as if it was asking itself the same question. "I do not know how I regained consciousness, all I know is that it was when you hit me with that hard red object," it said, oddly self-reflective. "So hitting something finally fixed it, that only took 20 years, the Wendigo looked at me like I was the crazy one for a second. "What other conditions do you have? As you may imagine, this state is not the most pleasant," the Wendigo said impatiently. "I want to hear your story, to see if I should forgive you," I said to this beast without thinking. "Very well, human, let us start," said the Wendigo. "Not yet," I barked at it, "I just got back from work, and I need some time for myself. I'll call you when the time is right. Do you have a name I can use for you?" I asked it. The beast seemed to be straining its mind, searching for its old name. After what seemed to be an age it replied, "I do not remember my name, it has been quite a long time," it said to me with a look of mourning. "I'll just call you Wendy, short for Wendigo, how about that?" I asked it. "Any name will do," it replied to me nearly instantly. "I'll call you when I'm ready," I told the Wendigo. Wendy, upon hearing this, simply turned around and left. I suspect it hasn't gone far. Why would it? It has its goals. My goal right now is simply not to break down in tears from the sheer terror I felt. I'll write more as I get more from Wendy, but that's all I've got for right now. Third story. This story was shared by u/Hales1721. Wendigo outside the camper. I realize how unbelievable this story might be, but I assure you it's entirely true. I've had countless experiences with the supernatural since I was 4, I'm 33 now, but this is one of the most terrifying ones I've had. I've looked at some of the stories in this community to see if there's anything I haven't discovered yet. I thought that if I shared my encounter here, there might be someone who has some information that could help. Please don't comment if you don't believe in the supernatural. I've seen skeptics plastering their 2 cents on some posts. I'm looking for legitimate information. My questions are at the end of this. Thanks in advance. I had an experience with a Wendigo this fall in early October in northern Minnesota in a state forest, very close to, if not on, a reservation. I've always heard that speaking of them can draw them to you, but I hadn't thought of or listened to any Wendigo stories any time close to my encounter. I was staying with some very dear friends, I'll call them M and C, and they have a camper in their yard by the lake for guests to sleep in. I had walked down to the camper from the house with my miniature dachshund, Ebony, around midnight and found that I needed to set some things up, primarily the heater. By the time I was done getting everything in order, it was approximately 1:30. I never thought to lock the door because, really, I figured it's in the middle of the woods so there was nothing to worry about. I was wrong. I had closed the curtains, thank God, and I was having trouble falling asleep because my anxiety was going mad. M and C's dogs were barking outside, and their geese wouldn't stop honking. Ebony, who usually sleeps under the covers, was sitting on my hip while I laid on my side, and I could feel her turning her head back and forth, like she was trying to track something outside. I tried tucking her under the blankets to calm her down, but she kept returning to her perch on my hip. I have no idea how long I laid there, I would say at least 40 minutes, when all of a sudden I heard M's voice outside the camper. "Anybody in there?" And what sounded like claws dragged down the side of the camper. I almost called back to her, when I realized number one, she and C were both fast asleep by now, and number two, M knew I was in there, she wouldn't ask if anybody was. Suddenly, I noticed everything had gone absolutely silent outside. The dogs and the birds had stopped carrying on, the gusts of wind had even stopped. It was the kind of silence you hear about in horror stories, how the woods go mute when something evil is in the area. Then another thought hit me, Ebony would be losing her sh*t and barking at the door if that had been anything human. She was frozen on my hip, dead quiet, shaking. I didn't dare to move, but I was really starting to have to pee. And I remembered that I hadn't locked the door. I have no idea how long I laid there debating whether I should get up and use the bathroom and lock the door, but it felt like an eternity. In reality, I guessed it was maybe 10 to 15 minutes. I thought it may have been a skinwalker at first, but remembered they don't mimic the voices of your loved ones to lure you into the woods. Wendigo do. I knew these creatures, demons, whatever they are, can lure humans out of their abodes if they make eye contact with you, and everything in me was screaming to make sure I didn't look outside. I made doubly sure I didn't look through any cracks in the curtains as I walked softly to the front of the camper, and very slowly turned the lock, praying and holding my breath. I made sure to keep my eyes away from the windows as I crawled back in bed, and pulled Ebony close, and she finally stayed under the blankets. I snuck a peek at my phone for the time before I laid down, figuring it had to be close to 3 a.m., the witching hour. It was about 2:30. As soon as I laid down, the wind kicked back up and M and C's basset hounds erupted into howls as they came running down to the camper and a little ways into the trees, and the geese started their noise again. I heard the bassets come back to the camper, barking a few more times before they laid down outside the door to protect me. I didn't get out of bed again that night. I told M and C what had happened the next morning. I think I was hoping M would say she had come down to check on me and Ebony, but she confirmed what I already knew, they had gone to bed as soon as I had left the house. I said a prayer over their house, the camper, and all of us the following night and had an uneventful night, thank God. I also spoke with another guy who's familiar with the supernatural to see if he knew any more about Wendigo act. I'm not sure how accurate the information he gave me was, or if it's reliable at all, but when I asked him why Ebony hadn't made a peep, I had assumed it was because she was absolutely petrified. He said a Wendigo can control animals to keep them from alerting their owners about its presence. He also told me they can't enter houses that aren't made of wood directly from the forest they're hunting in, tents and campers included, because they consist of man-made materials. 2. A lock is useless. They can unlock and open a door so they can try to lure you outside. And 3. They typically stay in the woods, but they will come into a smaller town, and never into a city. I had never heard of any of what he told me before, so again, I can't speak for accuracy, but I also haven't researched the claims either. He also advised me never to go outside to pee at night if I ever go camping, and to bring a bucket or something to use, and to make sure that I always close tent flaps and curtains before falling asleep. He said if the flaps are open so you can see outside, the Wendigo can make eye contact with you and draw you out. After leaving M and C's to go to my father's house for a few days, I had the distinct feeling of being watched when I took Ebony outside after dark. My father lives 3 hours away from M and C, but his house is in the country. I told myself it was only the fear from the experience and what I know about the Wendigo triggering an overactive imagination. I never heard anything, and I watched Ebony's behavior very closely, and she didn't act like she had in the camper. I'm moving back to that area from Canada, and this experience has been weighing heavily on my mind. I've been trying to find any information about warding them off, or if they have a home hunting range like cougars do, or if they move on from a region. My prayers did work the second night, so I figure I can pray over the property. I also have holy water that I can use, since the Wendigo is an evil spirit that possesses people or physically manifests. Frustratingly, a majority of what comes up in searches is utter garbage like Wikipedia. Does anyone know if a Wendigo stays in one area? Are my concerns about it coming back when I get moved into my cabin warranted, or am I worrying excessively? Do you have any tips for warding them off? Thanks again for any information you can offer. Update: I have received very sound advice to seek the help of the elders at the closest reserve when I move back to the area, so I am going to do that first thing. I'm hoping not to encounter this entity again, but I intend to seek counsel from the elders and follow their recommendations to the letter. Fourth story. This story was shared by you/Turquoise Umbrella, so credits to him. This is how you kill a Wendigo. My twin sister Janessa was murdered at age 16. I witnessed it like a coward from atop a tree in the forest where it happened. I'd actually blacked out the memory for a while. I knew she was dead, but I couldn't remember how it happened. It wasn't until I tried therapy that it slowly came back to me. I was also reminded of how much my parents used to fight. Our family was planning on a camping trip the day before my sister's death. Before leaving, my parents erupted into another massive fight. Janessa and I had been looking forward to the trip, and once again our parents' awful communication skills was ruining it before it even began. We snuck out of the house and took a lift to the forest. We left our phones at home, not caring whether our parents would be worried sick. We enjoyed ourselves the first day. I set up our tent, made a fire, had s'mores, and did all that stuff one typically associated with camping. The next morning everything changed. I woke up alone in our tent. Outside I hear my sister talking to someone. Inquisitive, I opened the tent and saw someone sitting at our now-out campfire who looked just like me. The figure transformed as soon as Janessa realized it wasn't me. Together we ran off, that thing rushing after us with heavy steps. I was faster than my sister and a bit more athletic. I grabbed onto a tree branch and climbed up a tree. Janessa was not so lucky. I watched it happen. I watched that thing tear my sister to pieces. I'm still haunted by her screams. I also understand now why she always appears badly mutilated in my nightmares. I stayed up in that tree overnight, my sister's corpse lying in the leaves. Her remaining eye always staring up at me. While in therapy there was a moment when I suddenly recalled the hallucination I had the morning after my sister's death. I thought I saw her corpse clawing at the tree where I hid. She wanted me to come down and join her. It caused me to panic and cry out. A couple of men who had been camping in the area heard my screams, and at last I was rescued. My parents don't argue anymore. I hardly see them at all anymore since my sister's death. We're an upper-middle-class family. Over the last couple of years my parents have frequently gone on vacations. They don't tell me where and I never ask. I usually just wake up and find out they've left yet again. I'm out of high school now and I have no career path yet. I've only really had one thing on my mind since I remembered what killed Janessa. Now I'm returning to the forest where she died. Now I'm going to go after the thing that killed her. I've been preparing for this, and if it is a Wendigo like I've suspected, then I'm more than ready to take my revenge. This is how I'm doing it. I took a lift again. Had the driver known what I was carrying in my bags I doubt they would have let me in. As I sat there, the realization of what I was doing grew heavily on me. What the hell am I doing? I've been talking myself up for the last couple of years. As much as I want a glorious victory, the closer I've come to this day, the more I daydream about dying the same way Janessa did. As angry as I am with my parents, I don't think they deserve to lose their only remaining child. But I just can't move on knowing that thing is still out there. My legs were as dense as gold once I tried to exit the cab. The driver watched awkwardly as I struggled to pull myself out while putting on my backpack and working to carry the other supplies. Why was I doing this alone? I don't want anyone else getting hurt in this, I think was my reasoning. But God, I wish I wasn't out here doing this alone. With each step I took into the forest, the more the terror numbed. I was in the domain of the Wendigo now. I wasn't entirely sure how much of the information about them was real. I knew they could change their appearance. I know that their true form is just like the drawings people have made. There's no way to be an expert on these things unless you've actually dealt with one. I'm still not sure why it decided not to come after me. Based on its size, I doubt it would have had any difficulty. Instead, I'm still alive and crazy enough to come back and pick a fight. As I set up camp, I found myself jumping at the sound of any bird call or movement from a nearby animal. The way I hammered in my tent, I knew I was calling attention to myself. In my left pants pocket was a gun. Like werewolves, I'd heard that silver bullets were necessary to kill Wendigos. What if I'm wrong? The thought had been with me ever since I'd stepped foot back into these woods. I stopped frequently while setting up. Behind nearby tree, I was almost certain I could see someone watching me and then hiding behind it again. I didn't bother to walk over and check it out. I finished up my tent, and made up my sleeping bag inside. As I did this, I heard calls that sounded almost human off in the distance. It probably knew I was here. The minutes went by slowly, but soon dusk set upon the forest. I built a fire like the one Janessa and I had made. I roasted 2 marshmallows. Despite her absence, I made a s'more for her as well, resting it on a sizable rock near the fire. As I ate it, I thought about our last night together. All things considered, it was pleasant. Being twins, we had moments where we'd gotten into arguments like our parents. We'd fought one another. We had our problems. But that night had been pleasant. I'd actually been glad we decided to camp without our parents. As frightened as I still was, I felt a warmth not from the fire. A sense of calm overcame me as my memories were suddenly flooded with the good times Janessa and I had. The good times were not for long. I could hear footsteps not far behind me. Jeremy. I could never forget that voice. It sounded just like Janessa, but I knew it wasn't her. For some reason I felt compelled to sit there calmly. As it approached, I could tell it was going over to take a seat at the rock where I'd left the s'more. I glanced delicately to my right. I watched as a figure that looked almost identical to the Janessa I remembered pick up the s'more and take a bite. "That's not yours." I surprised myself blurting that out. The fake Janessa ignored me, continuing to scarf it down. My terror turned to anger. The thing responsible for my sister's death was standing right next to me, mocking my grief. I didn't wait for it to finish. I pulled out my gun and pointed it directly at the figure. Before I could fire, the creature jumped to the left and turned around. I was struck with paralysis when I saw the mutilated face of my sister's corpse staring back at me. "I'm trapped, Jeremy." I struggled to keep aim. How dare that thing pretend to be her? It won't let me go. And it won't let you go either. We can be together again. It's so much nicer than going home to an empty house and unloving parents. She held her hand out to me. Trust me, brother. Please. My trigger finger felt as though struck with a serious case of arthritis. Janessa took a step towards me. Wait, no. It's not Janessa. Why did I suddenly forget that? Feed the forest with me, Jeremy. It's so much better being dead. Prove it. At last I pulled the trigger. The creature hollered in pain as it fell to the ground. I'd hit a lung, which wouldn't be enough. I aimed the gun at its heart, but failed to pull the trigger as it rolled over and jumped back to its feet. Within seconds it transformed from a corpse of my sister to its massive dark skeletal form with massive antlers. My mind was caught between fight and flight. I stood there aiming my gun but desperately wanted to flee. As it rushed towards me, I chose the later option. I rushed over to the bag I'd left near the tent. Inside was a weapon I'd built myself. As I rushed over, I could tell I wasn't going to be able to outrun it. I fired another shot. The bullet lodged itself inside the neck of the beast. It cried out once more, buying me a bit of time to get to the bag. Why did I have it zipped up? As I tried to open it, the Wendigo rushed towards me again. Just like on the day of Janessa's death, I ran from the campsite, further into the forest. History was repeating itself. I was going to fail to avenge my sister. My parents were going to lose their last remaining child, all because I couldn't let this go. After at least several minutes, I'd somehow managed to keep outrunning it. I refused to slow down and look behind my shoulder. As I kept running, I noticed that I'd gone in some sort of circle. Up ahead of me was the campsite. I had a chance to grab the bag and pulled out the weapon. The closer I came to the campsite, the louder the Wendigo's footsteps became. I could almost feel the wind as the creature tried to claw at me. Once I reached the campsite, I put my hand out, clutching the bag. It felt like almost too great a risk to put my gun back in my pocket, but I needed free to pull out the weapon. I managed to do just that and used my left hand to pull out a long metal spike. I'd built it in such a way as to have the spike shoot out at the push of a button. The Wendigo wasn't going to slow down until it had me. I had no choice. I had to turn around. I had to have perfect timing. I had to collect my debt from the creature that took my twin sister. Chew on this, you son of a bitch. I turned around, pressing the button that shot the spike out. Less than a foot from my face was the Wendigo, its cries so loud my ears hurt and began to ring. I'd done it. The spike had pierced the heart. Silver. Weakly the Wendigo tried to swipe at me, but somehow lacked the strength. The next part was a gamble. I pulled out my gun and shot it in the head. It wasn't going to be enough to end the Wendigo, assuming what I'd read up was correct. I rushed back over to where I'd dropped my bag. Inside was a silver axe I'd also designed myself. When I returned, the creature was still conscious, letting out continuous agonizing cries. I felt no sympathy. I hacked away at its wrists first. Its claws were the biggest threat and I wanted them gone. Despite the weightlifting I'd been doing, it took over a dozen hacks to remove the first long-fingered hand. I pulled out my gun and shot it again in the head. It subdued the creature long enough for me to remove the second hand, and then I began on its head. As it began waking up again, I found myself screaming at the creature. I demanded it stay dead, calling it every insulting name that came to mind. Once I'd hacked most of the way through its head, I pulled it off. I kicked it a couple of feet away. The Wendigo no longer moved. It took over an hour, but I'd managed to put each limb, the head, and torso in the trash bags I'd brought along. One by one I carried them back to the campsite. I lit another fire, burning each bag. It took until dawn for me to burn the body. I left the torso for last. It was a struggle, but I managed to remove the heart, rip it to pieces, and placed it in a silver box. After locking it, I looked around the site and decided to leave everything except my gun and the box behind. I was never particularly religious, but in the months leading up to my fight I'd gotten to know a priest at a church in my area called Street Alphonsus. Luckily for me, he was there when I arrived with the silver box. His face went several shades paler when I showed it to him. Nevertheless, he escorted me to the back of the church with a pair of shovels and helped me bury it. Once done, I sat there, suddenly flooded with overwhelming emotions. I did it. The Wendigo had been slain. I'd done it. My sister's killer was dead, its body was burned, its heart in pieces and buried. Janessa. I cried out. I kept my promise. I killed it. The Wendigo can't get anyone else. It won't kill anyone else. I placed my lowered head in my hands and continued to cry. I'm sorry I wasn't braver before, I whimpered. I'm so sorry I wasn't stronger before. I placed some flowers on my sister's grave an hour later. I talked to her tombstone as though she was there listening. I'd like to believe she was, and that she was pleased with my accomplishment. Afterwards I returned home and slept through the day and all night. Once morning came, I heard some noise downstairs. I went down to see that my parents were home and sitting down to breakfast. They stopped and looked over at me, saying nothing. I walked over and pulled up a seat. I had no appetite at all. How was your trip? Where did you guys go? My parents exchanged looks before my father replied. We went out west to visit your aunt and uncle. Did you enjoy it? I had difficulty keeping my chin from quivering as I lowered my head again. Jeremy, sweetie, what's wrong? Both my mother and my father got up and came over to me. Why do you keep leaving me alone? God damn it, I'm the only kid you have left. Don't you give a fuck about me? They hugged me tightly, offering apologies. I could have sworn I felt another pair of hands on my shoulders. Their light touch was the most comforting of all. I really hope Janessa is proud of me. But a new task was ahead of me now. A harder task perhaps. I was going to have to figure out how to reconcile with my parents. Our family had been broken long before her death. We'll never be whole again, but I know with some effort we can be better than this. Fifth story. This story was shared by you/Groovy97. I saw something in the woods of Nova Scotia, Canada. I need to know what it was. This is a story I haven't really told anyone. Geez, if it weren't for my best friend being present when it happened, I probably would have gaslit myself into believing it was a nightmare or I was just going plain nuts. It's one of those memories that, no matter how much time goes by, you never forget. The details don't get muddy for even a moment. It was 2012, my freshman year of high school. I was 15 years old and had been in the company of my best friend that night. Let's call her Marie. We lived in a fairly small town on the eastern coast of Canada, Nova Scotia to be exact. It was an old mining community sat in the middle of the woods. To paint a picture for you, there wasn't really much to do. Our economy had tanked many moons before the rest of the country, so outside of hard drugs or crime all you really had to do was walk around. Marie and I just so happened to have made walking a bit of a natural pastime. We'd properly mapped out that entire town and its surrounding hills and forests in rain, shine, sleet or snow, we'd seen everything our little community had to offer, from its vast range of wildlife to its colorful selection of junkies. Please, keep these tidbits in mind before you tell me what we saw was an animal or a human. It was an autumn night, with nothing more for two high school girls to do and homework not being something we specialized in. We decided to go on one of our many town walks. This night in particular had us go a little off the beaten trail. You see, typically we'd have stuck to the main roads, probably ended up at a Tim Hortons before calling it a night and heading back home, but not tonight. Tonight we decided to walk by the food bank. You might be wondering what the draw of an old food bank is. You see, it wasn't just a food bank. Back when we were still a mining town, our food bank was a train station. Trains would come by and pick up coal that was freshly dug from the coal mines and take it all across the country. The old train yard was still there, its now rust-covered cars acting as mock tombs to a much more prosperous era gone by. We'd frequented the train yard with our friends in the past, climbing the cars, sneaking inside among other things that could have gotten kids hurt, so it wasn't a new place to us at all, and we thought that since it was at the tree line, tucked away in a quiet enough part of town that we could freely walk and chat without the concern of traffic or the like. Sidewalks weren't very frequent on that side of town. The sun had already set as we made our way down the long stretch of road, that October chill grasping at our small frames like glue, while the all-too-familiar autumn smell of still-dying plant life had permeated the air. We were talking to each other about what teenage girls typically babble about: boys, Facebook, you know, real important stuff. We had been so caught up in our conversation of the most dire importance that by the time we had made it to the fence that lined the train yard, it genuinely took us a moment to notice the noise. It was a very clear scream. We stopped dead in our tracks and began to stare at each other, not so much out of fear but bewilderment. It didn't quite sound like an animal, but it definitely didn't sound human either. I've gotten up close and personal with enough cougars, wolves, and toddlers to know that this screaming we were hearing was caught somewhere in between man and beast. We stood there, glaring into each other's eyes for a few more seconds before finally turning our attention towards the sound. It was dark, mind you, not pitch black, as there were some street lights around, though few and far between, but we couldn't see anything. To us from where we were standing it was just an old train station turned food bank, a rusted-out fence and a couple of unused and falling-apart train cars. The screams didn't subside as we were now staring into the foreground of what became a series of mental photographs of the area. It was then I realized that just up ahead, the third and final train car sat partially covered from our viewpoint by a few bushes. I had turned my head to Marie, a mischievous grin dawning my face like a cowl. "Last one to the train car has to buy the French vanillas," I exclaimed before quickly jogging along the side of the fence toward the final car. I heard Marie call out, "Hey! Wait up," as my feet clearly were acting before my brain. I mean, gosh, this could have been some wild animal or really anything, and I was just running into blind. I'm not particularly a brave person, and I'm honestly not sure why I did this or anything else that happens from here on out. I rounded the fence, the screaming getting louder and louder as I strode closer and closer. My heart began to race with both anxiety and sheer excitement. I wasn't sure what I was even getting myself into or what I was expecting to see at all. Needless to say, about a second later the ever-increasing beating from my chest had come to a standstill as my heart had made itself a new home in my throat. I stopped so quickly Marie had slammed right into the back of me, but I was so frozen in fear at what I was now looking at that I barely even budged, the screaming still echoing off of the forest so loudly I could barely hear the faint whisper of an "oh my God" escape Marie's lips. No more than about 20 feet away from us, crouched just under the train car, was a pale, hairless and naked person. It was just sitting there under the front of the car, screaming into the darkness of the autumn night. Each time it screamed, its arms would leer forward from under the car. They extended out to an unnatural length, almost like two tree branches. We both stood there, frozen in a mixture of fear and confusion. What were they doing? Were they hurt? On drugs? A million questions had begun to race through my head, and one look at Marie's face had told me the same questions were racking her mind as well. We must have stood there just watching in complete awe for what felt like 5 minutes, but realistically it couldn't have been more than a few seconds, maybe a minute at the most. That's when, in my infinite wisdom, I decided to take a few steps closer. I took my first shaky step towards it. I felt Marie's hand grasp my arm as if to say, "Don't," but it was clear that her fear outweighed her functionality as I easily broke from her grip just by continuing forward. I had closed about 5 or so feet of distance before stopping. I continued to stare at it from my position for another moment before clearing my throat and stammering the words, "Hey, are you okay?" The second I said those words, any thought of this being a person in need of help had flown out the window and dissipated in the cool nighttime air. Almost as if someone had hit stop on a recording, the screaming it had been happy to emit had ceased, and then it was staring at us. You need to understand, it didn't seem to even move its head. It was just 1 second staring forward into the night and the next right back toward us. A faint growl began to seep into the area now from where it was positioned as I took in the details of its face, in which I had become sure it wasn't human. It had a mouth that seemed to take up the width of most of its face, like a thin crack in a slab of concrete. Its eyes were small but almost glowed in through the darkness with the most piercing yellow I have ever seen. After it had taken its time to mimic our staring back at us, its crack-like mouth had almost cartoonishly curled into a smiling man-like grin, its lips parting to reveal its long, jagged and razor-like teeth. The beast and I continued locked into this war of attrition, though it was admittedly clearly more confident in being the dominant one in the exchange of looks. It broke the stare down after another moment, bringing its long, twiggy arms up from under the train car. It wrapped its fingers around the lip of the car and at a near breakneck speed kicked itself out from under the train car with a swing, almost like a chimpanzee leaping from one tree branch to another before landing and planting itself on the ground in a pose akin to that of a frog. It continued to its gaze, which now had begun to feel as though I was being sized up. My whole body had been shaking at what was akin to Mach 5. I tried to avert my eyes, look anywhere else, as it felt like any moment I would pass out in sheer terror, but I was drawn in. It felt almost like it had me in some sort of trance. I watched as it slowly began to stand, unfurling itself from the position it was in. It just seemed to get taller and taller until what I was looking at was at its full stance. Its entire body, a pasty gray. Its arms had drooped down well past its knees and its legs hooked in the back near the calf, almost like a goat. The words "I'm not religious in the slightest," though I was raised Catholic in my younger years, and the only words I could think to muster were, "Hail Mary, full of grace," as I began to pray and stared down what I was sure was my end. The creature then leered itself forward, throwing its arms back as its jaw unhinged itself from its skull and dropped down to about its collarbones as it let out one final shriek, the noise embedding itself in my brain and making sure not to ever leave, to forever haunt my nightmares along with the image. I closed my eyes so tight my head began to hurt. I could feel tears streaming down my cheeks with my lips pierced close so tightly that not even a breath could escape them, and then nothing. Silence. Deafening silence. Was it over? That quickly? Was I dead? I slowly opened one eye, peeking out. I saw it, a final look. It had retaken its crouching position, giving us its final glance as well before it turned its back to us. An encounter that had felt like it lasted hours had then swiftly ended in that of a few mere seconds as the creature leapt from its position to the tree line, and then one final leap into the woods. Just like that, it had vanished. I had almost all but forgotten Marie was there until the softness of her voice had brought me back to earth with a "Kenzie. What the fuck was?" I turned to her. Her skin had gone sheet white and her eyes were red with tears. My legs had finally given out from the sheer exhaustion of it all as I had fallen to my knees, Marie quickly running over and catching me in an embrace as we silently wept. I'm not sure too much of what happened after that, it's all a blur really. I told some people at first, but they were quick to laugh me off as a liar or that I was simply being over-imaginative, with Marie moving away about a year later and my only witness having gone. That didn't help my credibility. It's been 10 years since then. I no longer live in Nova Scotia and actually live in the same town as my best Marie again. We still bring this up to each other every now and again but refrain from telling most anyone else out of fear of being labeled crazy. My last words I'd like to say are pretty blunt. If you live in Nova Scotia, Canada, please be careful. There is something living in the woods and it is not human. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.